I'm at the University of New South Wales, and I'm leading an expedition called the Australasian Antarctic Expedition 2013-14. And this is inspired by a trip that went south by one of the great explorers and scientists that we know from Australia called Sir Douglas Mawson. And this was the first expedition he led. It went down between 1911 and 1914. Using their original logo, so the penguin there on the right hand side is actually an Edwardian penguin from the original expedition. It was on the cutlery of that trip 100 years ago, and we've used that for our expedition. And if you want to learn more about what we're doing and how you can get involved and following up some of the things we'll be talking about, visit the website spiritofmawson.com, and a lot of the information I'm talking about, or where you can find more information, is on that website. Now, I've been very fortunate. I've been down to Antarctica 3 times, and in different places, including the South Geographic Pole. In 2012, we were there for the centenary of Scott of the Antarctic's arrival. So for those of you who heard of Scott of the Antarctic, it was 1912, January 17th, 1912. He was allegedly racing to the South Pole to be the first person there, and tragically found out that he'd been beaten by a whole month by the Norwegians, led by an explorer called Roald Amundsen. But the British expedition ended in tragedy. 5 men died, including Scott himself. And in spite of that, they continued doing scientific observations. They were off the map. These were guys who were off the actual map. It was the Edwardian equivalent of space travel. And you often hear about these tales of a race between the British and the Norwegians. And when I started looking into it more and more, I realised that actually it wasn't just a race. There were 5 teams down in Antarctica. There was the British, the Norwegians. There were the Japanese who were down there. They came through Sydney. People thought they were spies, which was incredible, and they put extra sentries on some of the military forts there. They came through. It caused a huge uproar, and then became the massive height of fashion when people go down and have photos of their babies on the leader's lap, a guy called Nobu Shirazi. And but they went through there, and they actually got down to Antarctica. They got to 82 degrees south with dogs. They've got some of the most splendid film footage in the world. They went down there and they filmed themselves with emperor penguins, which are about 1.30 meters high or so. If you go to my popular science website, christurney.com, shown here on the screen, you can see some of the YouTube footage from this 100-year-old film of them punching penguins in the face, which is terribly wrong but quite entertaining. So if you want a bit of a laugh, go to that site and you can have a look there. We had the Germans. They were down there as well. A guy called Wilhelm Filchner. He went into the Weddell Sea in the bottom part of the Atlantic, and they had basically a Lord of the Flies situation. They got locked in sea ice for 8 months. They were drunk huge amounts of the time. They were fighting. They were challenging each other to duels. People took shots at one another. People died. At one moment, Wilhelm Filchner writes in his diary, "Last night I slept on the floor with my rifle and cartridge by my side in case Dr. Van Girdel tried to shoot me through a wall." I mean, it's fantastic. Completely out of control. They should have... How they actually got back alive, I don't know. Anyway, but very entertaining. So when I was starting to look into this, I thought these are great stories, but you often only hear part of a story. I think the German one and the Japanese ones are barely known. But they all did amazing amounts of science. The Germans, incredibly, in spite of the fact that they were fighting the whole time and trying to kill each other, they still carried on doing science. And they started doing science as soon as they left the North Atlantic. And as their ship came down the Deutschland through the Atlantic, they were measuring temperature and saltiness of the oceans all the way as they came through the Atlantic. And they first ones to realise that the Atlantic system was a big conveyor belt. The ocean circulated. Cold, salty water would sink in the North Atlantic, drop down below to the ocean depths, and then return to the surface very slowly along the seabed as this enormous conveyor belt system. And a similar process they discovered in Antarctica. So they connected the two up and showed it was this conveyor belt system. And that's incredibly important for the way our planet operates, how it redistributes heat. The Germans did that. In spite of trying to take shots at each other and kill each other. Why not? But and they also had amazing ways of funding their own expeditions. The Germans funded their work from a lottery. They had a national lottery to fund their expedition. Quite incredible. But also, of course, on top of that, we also had the Australians and New Zealanders, led by Douglas Mawson. And they were desperate to find out what lay south of Australia. And so I wanted to put all these great stories together, but also talk about the science that they did, the other part of the story that was integral to those expeditions, which has been largely forgotten. And that's what led to the book 1912, The Year the World Discovered Antarctica. And while I was researching that, I was really keen to see ways in which they communicated and excited the public. This was the heyday of science communication. 100 years ago, they went out there and they got people excited about science and exploration. It wasn't just a case of telling you science is important, you should know it because it's good for you. They wanted to sell a story, and I think stories are incredibly important for getting people excited by science. And so much so, but they didn't have national funding. There wasn't Antarctic divisions or science programs. They went out there and got money from the public. They sold newspaper deals, they did the first documentaries, they did a whole range of different things to get people interested. And so as part of that, I got in contact with the National Film and Sound Archive, as Imelda was saying, and amazingly the Australians took south one of the great Australian photographers and cameramen, a man called Frank Hurley, who you may have heard of. He was a very famous photographer. He did a number of Antarctic expeditions. He went to Papua New Guinea. He did a lot of work on the Western Front during the First World War. And he contributed anyway, made really the first documentary ever made, which was called Home of the Blizzard, and it was based on Mawson's expedition. And the film footage is held by the National Film and Sound Archive, along with a load of other great stuff, as Imelda was referring to, including Ernest Shackleton's voice, who we'll look at later, and a whole load of other people. So if you go to their website, or go to my website, christurney.com, it'll link through to the National Film and Sound Archive, and you can see some of the movie clips of this incredible expedition 100 years ago. And that was great ways of exciting the public. So inspired by that, the last 3 years we've been going down to Antarctica. We've been using a whole range of different science media to get people interested in science and show people what we're doing. So we've been down to the South Pole, as I was referring to, and we sent movie footage from there. We've been down in blizzards and all sorts of stuff, surrounded by penguins, loading up movie footage. And if you go to the YouTube channel, you can see it there. You can follow us on Intrepid Science on Facebook and Google+. We're on Instagram, a whole range of things, and you can follow us in the field on Twitter at Prof. Chris Turney. And it was very much inspired by what these guys did 100 years ago. So if we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the sort of thing you'd have found. If you opened up an atlas 100 years ago, the bottom third of the southern hemisphere was just completely blank. It was basically an unexplored region. You can hopefully recognise here a large part of Australia and New Zealand, South America, and a few bits of pink and orange around what we now know as Antarctica. Now, people had spotted this land, but no one really knew what it was. Was it a series of islands? Was it one large continent? Was it two? No one really knew. And this actually made people incredibly cross and angry. This was the dawn of a modern era, and no one knew what the surface of our planet looked like. The bottom third was unknown, and a lot of the atlases actually had stamped across it, unexplored region. This one's a particularly patriotic one. Remember, Australia and New Zealand was part of the empire at that point, with a picture of an outline of a British Isle stamped over the South Pole. So there you go. If anyone's got any question mark over who it belonged to, it was the Brits, according to the Scottish Geographical magazine. So that's where it is. Just the next one there. So to give you some sort of context, where Mawson went to, the Australasian Antarctic expedition, they were the only one out of the 5 that decided they weren't going to go for the South Geographic Pole, that point on the Earth's surface around which our planet actually rotates. It's a point on the surface around the axis of our planet. Mawson was far more interested in just how Antarctica related to Australia. They didn't know what was south of Australia. We didn't know how the climate system down there influenced Australia. There was recognition at the time that southerly winds, which must have come from the Antarctic region, had an impact, but we didn't know how it really related. And there was also a recognition at the time, 100 years ago, that the plants and the animals and actually the geology of a lot of the southern continents, South America, Africa, Australia, were very, very similar. And no one really knew how that worked. And one of the ideas was sometime in the past, Antarctica or something in the region of Antarctica linked across and actually to Australia and those other southern continents. Now, this was actually before the idea of a concept of plate tectonics. So at the time, no one really knew that the surface of the continents moved around and shuffled around on the surface. And instead they had these fantastic ideas that there had been land bridges connecting up all the continents, and that allowed the animals and the plants to migrate across over millions of years. And then sometime in the past, a sort of geological version of Atlantis, those land bridges just sunk below the waves. And so there was real interest that maybe we could try and find some of those land bridges. So Commonwealth Bay, which was actually off the map, was the main focus of the Australian base. Get the next slide. But just to give you some sort of context, I know 100 years seems a long time ago, but I've been doing a lot of work in the Ellsworth Mountains, which is closer to South America. And there, that area was only explored really properly and mapped in the 1960s and 70s. It's that recent. It's not that long ago. I know it might seem an age to you, but to us old fogies, 60s, 70s isn't that long ago. And that's the thing, and if you end up going into science exploration and you end up going and working in Antarctica, and there's some other places of the world as well, where you will probably be the first people to have ever seen that. It's very easy when you go on Google Maps and Google Earth and you think, wow, it's all mapped here. Well, it is from the space. But there's large areas that have never been explored on land, on the surface. And Antarctica is just great for this. So there's lots of people who really kick-started Antarctic exploration, but probably one of the great heroes is this man, Ernest Shackleton. And if you want to hear his voice, he's got a fantastic 2.5-minute audio clip, which was the height of technology at the time. It was the most you could get onto one sound file. It's there online on the National Film and Sound Archive. You can hear this man. He's one of the great Antarctic explorers and leaders. They even sell books on his leadership style. It's got to the New York Times bestseller list. This man never lost a person in Antarctica. No one ever died on one of his expeditions. You can hear his voice online. And he was desperate. In 1907, he'd been south early with Scott. He was desperate to go down again. He wanted to lead a trip and claim all the glory. He wanted to get to the South Geographic Pole. He wanted to get to the South Magnetic Pole. And the magnetic pole, in contrast to the geographic, is where the Earth's magnetic field points directly down. There's no horizontal force at all. It's just straight down. And he decided he wanted to go down there and lead a team. He was massively in debt. He had the gift of the blind. This man led an expedition that was basically had no cash. He took an expedition down. He was owing the equivalent of about $10-15 million. He was in debt when he went south. Incredible. And he still went down. Next slide. Thank you. Or next one again. And he took some great Australian scientists. This man here, Edgeworth David, an Australian geologist, he was desperate to go down. He was going to go down on Shackleton's ship just for the summer when they were going to drop off Shackleton's team. And he suddenly realised that Antarctica and Shackleton were a great way of exciting people in science and exploration. He also had quite a scary wife by all accounts. It was only on the ship he allegedly decided he was going to stay south with Shackleton and not go back for the end of the summer, and wrote a letter to his wife which was sent back saying, "Thanks darling, I'm staying another year. Can you sort it out with my university where I work? Hope everything's okay. See you in 12 months. And somehow he managed to stay married to her after he got back, which is all good. And then he also took down one of his former students, a man called Douglas Mawson, who'd written to Edgeworth David, his old supervisor, and said, "I'd love to come south with you." And Shackleton said, "Superb, I'll take you down." And these guys basically headed up the science program on Shackleton's expedition. And they were down there a full 12 months. They survived the winter darkness, and they, Edgeworth David and Mawson, which is the photo in the left here, walked 1,300 kilometres and got to the edge of a magnetic pole region. This was the longest unsupported sledging journey in the world. They carried all their foods with them and barely got home alive. And Edgeworth David is in the middle here. He was 51 at the time. Spent the last 50 kilometres walking on his ankles because his feet were so sore. They just couldn't walk anymore. And somehow got out alive. Shackleton, though, forged a whole new path up into Antarctica, climbed what we now know as the longest mountain range in the world, the Transantarctic Mountains, realised they were running out of food when their horse, which was carrying most of the food, disappeared down a massive crevasse, and pushed on what they call starvation rations. They went down to a quarter of what they should have been eating a day. And 100 nautical miles out from the pole, they realised they couldn't get any further. They put the flag up in the top right, took a photo, and dashed for home. And he was an amazing writer. If you ever read any of Shackleton's stuff, he talks about, he writes about food lies ahead of us. death stalks us from behind, and how they managed to get back is a complete mystery, because the photo in the bottom right shows the 4 men that got to within 100 miles of the South Geographic Pole, and Shackleton's second on the left. That's the same man we saw a shot of 2 slides before. He's got a huge beard, he looks like he's about 70. Incredible character, but yet he survived, and that was the start of a Shackleton legend. No one died, and they nearly got it all. So 100 years ago, suddenly the race was on. The South Geographic Pole still had to be explored, but there was this vast continent that no one knew anything about. You had the Australians, the Kiwis, the Germans of Filchner, the Japanese of Shirazi, you had Amundsen for the Norwegians, and you had Scott for the British. But it was really the Australians which were inspirational. This was a man, Mawson, who was 28 years old, who decided he was going to go south and discover what lay there. 28. No pressure, guys. I'm an old one at 40. He decided he was going to fundraise in 1 year the equivalent of $25 million in 1 year. He bought a ship, he stocked out the science team, he took all the gear, he even had the first wireless system. They were sending radio observations back 100 years ago, reporting the weather in Antarctica and Macquarie Island, which is between the two, and relaying it back to Australia. There was all sorts of science questions they wanted to find out, and they wanted to see how Antarctica, or this part of Antarctica, fitted into Australia. Now, unfortunately for Mawson, they couldn't find many places to land, and in the end they came across one place called Commonwealth Bay, and that's where they put their main base. And this is a profile of a hut they were there. This is the windiest place in the world. It's in the Guinness Book of Records, has an average wind speed of 70 kilometers an hour. Now that's an average, and as we all know with averages, that covers a huge range. It can go up to 200 kilometers an hour they had there, down to calm conditions. And the reason for that is you have these amazing katabatic winds, these strong cold winds that come off the polar plateau at about 3,000 meters above sea level and roll down the hill slopes to the sea. So if you've opened a fridge or a freezer and you see that cold air billowing out, that's the same sort of concept. Basically, it's an enormous fridge and you see these big waves of cold winds coming down. Average wind speed 70 kilometers an hour. You can't survive in tents in that. You need a hut, you need a structure long term. So it's fine during the daylight, you can sort of see what you're doing, but you need somewhere that not only can give you shelter, but can keep you warm. Now during the summertime you have 24-hour daylight, but in the wintertime you have 24-hour darkness. And so these guys were cooped up in this place all winter, having to try and get on with one another, do science, and get prepared for the big push out to explore the environment the following summer. So they put up this amazing pre-built structure, but you can see the snowbanks on either side. It quickly filled up with snow. There's some fantastic photos we'll hopefully see later of them having to climb out of the windows in the ceiling so they could get out, because all the doors were blocked up with snow and ice. This is another plan of the hut here on the left, but on the right shows you what it looks like today. It's been badly bashed and battered, but it's still standing. It's an amazing piece of Australian heritage there, where you've got this beautiful hut preserved from 100 years ago. So much, if you've seen Scott or Shackleton's huts online, and Google have got these fantastic street view maps where you can go into the huts and explore. This is Australia's one, Mawson's hut. And they did phenomenal science. These guys weren't just based on Commonwealth Bay. There was another one, 2,500 kilometres long, what we know now as the Shackleton Ice Shelf. And they had another team on Macquarie Island. And these guys were doing science the whole way. They took weather observations all the time, seeing how the weather pressure systems in Antarctica related to Australia. You may have heard of the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights. Well, we have the equivalent in the south. Don't really see them in Australia, but that's called the Aurora Australis. And here on the top right, that fuzzy image is actually the first photograph ever taken of the Aurora Australis. But now, of course, we've got beautiful colour, and you see the greens and the other colours in there. But that was the first ever photo of that. And they effectively had a fourth ship as well. This was the Aurora, the ship. It sailed across the Southern Ocean. There's a picture there in the bottom right. And they were out there measuring temperature and saltiness. And incredibly, trying to make sounding measurements of the seabed, looking for these sunken land bridges, which in the past they thought had linked up Antarctica to Australia, and of course now we know they never existed. Plate tectonics came along, but this was actually sort of final proof, really, that those land bridges never existed. So as a result of all these amazing endeavours, we actually got an outline of a map that we sort of recognise as Antarctica today. You get an outline there that doesn't look too dissimilar to the next image, which is what you'd see in the atlas today. Now, a lot of people died to produce what we see as the map there. Scott lost 5 men. Mawson incredibly lost 2 men, and he was actually ended up stuck in Antarctica for a whole other year. They were 500 kilometres out. He was with 2 other men, a guy called Ninnis and another chap called Mertz, with sledges and dogs. They were going through a heavily crevassed part of the landscape, and when they were working their way through, they suddenly realised that their friend Ninnis had fallen down this crevasse with a sledge with most of the food and the best dogs, and they never saw Ninnis again. They couldn't see him, they couldn't hear him, they couldn't rescue him. And so they'd lost their friend, and they were 500 kilometres out. They'd taken 3.5 weeks to get to where they were, and they had 1.5 weeks worth of food left. So they realised that they'd have to go back as quickly as they could, but they were likely going to starve. And the only way they could survive was by eating the dogs that they had with them. The problem was, this was all before the discovery of vitamins, and they didn't realise that the livers of the dogs were toxic. And actually, they suddenly started, if you read their diaries, you suddenly start realising, they start referring to the fact that their hair's falling out, their skin's peeling off, they feel incredibly tired. Mawson's soles of his feet fell off, not his shoes, his feet of his soles fell off, and he'd have to strap them on every morning with a cream called lanolin and walk on that. But it was too much for Mertz, and eventually Mertz, in a fit of insanity, bit his finger off, passed out, and then died. And so Mawson was on his own. He was still over 100 kilometres out from base. He had a little bit of food, some dog food left, and he carried on. He pushed on. He kept making weather observations in the Mawson archive in Adelaide. He's still making weather observations. Even when his friends have died, he's still there writing, making weather observations. And as he's walking along, stumbling along, he cut his sledge in half, and as he's stumbling along, he fell down a crevasse. And by chance, the sledge had pinned itself against the far end of a crevasse, and by even more chance, some rope was wrapped around his body, connected to the sledge, and he's left there dangling 4 metres below. And over several hours, he somehow manages to pull himself up, fall back down again, pull himself up, and then understandably pass out when he got to the surface. How he didn't give up, I don't know. So what he did was, he decided he was going to build a rope ladder, put it around his body, connected to the sledge, and then any other time he fell down a crevasse, he'd just climb back up. And he did that several times. Amazing man. At 5 kilometres out, he finally stumbles across what they called Aladdin's Cave, which was a nice cave they'd built at the top of a glacier above their base. And he saw pineapple and oranges, and he realised, oh my gosh, the ship's in. He's 3 weeks late at this stage. The ship should have gone. He's desperate to get out, but then suddenly one more of those blizzards come in, those katabatic winds kick in, and he's stuck there for 5 days, just 5 kilometres out from the base and safety. So he spends his time, he hammers in nails into his boots, and then when the winds abate, he crawls out of the cave, and as he's coming down the glacier, he sees smoke on the horizon, and the ship left that morning. He was stuck for another year, and so he's stuck there with 5 other guys, incredible story, and spent the whole time making more observations and sort of trying to get his sanity back. If you read his diary, he says he sometimes worries he's off his head, he doesn't understand what's going on, and apparently a lot of the time he would just hang around friends just to sort of just be near someone because he'd been so isolated for so long. When they saw him, they asked who he was. They didn't even recognise which one of the 3 men he was. So amazing tales. And when those stories came out, it really excited people that, these guys aren't just going down to do adventure and risk their lives for no purpose. They're going down to understand how our planet works. And we forget that nowadays. We think it's all just about the adventure. But you'd never put yourself at risk just for the sake of an adventure. That'd be crazy. So, What we're planning to do, so some of the outcomes from the expedition were enormous. They didn't find the land bridges. They pulled together all these fantastic weather observations. They suddenly realised it's a pressure map, so you might have seen things like this with the weather forecast when you're watching the telly on the back of the papers. This is one of the first weather maps ever produced for Antarctica. This is the Friday, 29th of March 1912, the day we think Scott died, in the bottom right-hand corner. And it suddenly allows us to relate the weather in this part of Antarctica to Australia and the tropics. It was the first time we could actually relate what was going on globally. Never been seen before. So we're really inspired by this. I love the idea of stories. I think this is a great way of bringing science to people and getting them energized about science and exploration again. So I'm leading the Australasian Antarctic Expedition 2013-14, and we're going south to rediscover some of the excitement, I think, of science and exploration, but repeat the measurements as well of what Mawson's team did 100 years ago, and just see how much change has taken place. And this is the logo, this is the Edwardian logo I referred to earlier, which we were using for this expedition. So you might see it around in the papers quite a bit. We've got a fantastic science team, many Australians, we've got a lot of Kiwis, we've got some people coming from the US and from the UK. Including that, though, we've got a huge number of media involved. We've got Radio New Zealand coming down the first leg. We've also got ABC Lateline. They've been following us. They're going to be broadcasting in the next week about our preparations. But we've also got the BBC and the Guardian coming down with us. So you'll be able to read about us online, watch the progress, see film footage from those guys, listen on the World Service, and hear what we're doing. But there's ways you can take part. This is a privately funded expedition. We've got some research money from the government, but a lot of this is privately funded. And there's ways you can take part. If you're really keen, you can buy a berth and come and join us. There's actually some berths for sale. We're taking the public down to be science assistants. So on both legs, which is fantastic. There's one opportunity. This is our ship, the MV Akademik Shekalsky. It's an old spying vessel the Russians built in the 80s. There was a whole fleet of them going around spying on the West. This isn't a day when you guys, you never experienced the Soviets, but for your teachers, maybe some of your teachers and us other old folk here, remember the Soviets. No one talks about them nowadays. But in the 80s, there was a lot of spying going on in the polar regions. And so we're taking a spy ship with us, which is quite exciting. But it's also an ice-strengthened vessel, and that's going to be used to try and break through the sea ice and get into Mawson's Hut. And you can follow us virtually. You can take part in a whole load of science media, social media that we're using as a way of linking in. We're going to be using satellites to do this. So if you're on Google Plus or you've got a Gmail account, you'll probably have a Google Plus account without even realizing it. You can follow us on Intrepid Science. You can also follow us on Intrepid Science with Facebook as well. We're on YouTube. We're going to be posting movies every couple of days on the Chris Turney Intrepid Science channel. And you can also follow us on the field. We're going to be taking satellite phones. We're going to be tweeting. I'll be using Prof. Chris Turney, but there'll be a load of other people out there doing other work as well, and they'll be tweeting about the expedition. But one of the great things we can use with technology today that they did 100 years ago is that Mawson was using wireless. But we could take it to another level. With the satellites, not only can we send text, we can actually have a conversation just like we're having today. Google have got this software called Hangouts on Air, and some of you might be familiar with that. But it's an amazing way of having a conversation with 9, 10 other people, or between 10 people, but anyone else can watch. It's like having your own TV channel, and you can watch these things from around the world. And we're going to be broadcasting 9 Hangouts on Air, all the way across the sub-Antarctic islands, including Macquarie Island with amazing wildlife, down onto the ice, and as we try to get into Mawson's Hut. And those are on the website. So if you go to spiritofmawson.com, there's 9 Hangouts on Air. You can tune in, you can watch us, you can ask questions. It's not a one-way thing. It's an interactive discussion. We'll be there with the penguins and seals behind us, or the blizzard, or goodness knows what conditions we'll be finding. And we'll be able to have this conversation for about 20 minutes. And it's going to be 9 of them as we head south. So I do hope you'll be able to join us on that. But one of the big challenges we've got is that Mawson's Hut isn't readily accessible. There's been a big berg that's crashed up alongside. Actually, we've got the slide for that. Yeah, here we go. Brilliant. So this here on the left-hand side is a satellite image of how it looks today. And you might be able to make out in the bottom third, there's something called B90B. It's a large iceberg. It's the size of Luxembourg. And that's basically was drifting around the Antarctic coastline. and beached itself on the seabed. And the result is it's locked in this huge amount of sea ice around Commonwealth Bay. So if you did a Google image on Commonwealth Bay, you'll see these fantastic photos of ships just sailing nonchalantly into the bay when the winds aren't blowing and dropping people off. Now you can't do that. No one's been into the huts for the last 3 years. So we're going to be taking our vessel, the Schakowsky, and parking up alongside the edge of the sea ice. And it's about 60 kilometres, we estimate. We've got to try and cross, which I'll be leading a team, into and across that, to try to get into Commonwealth Bay and Mawson's huts. There's about 800 metres of sea below that. Now, one of the big dangers, of course, is falling through the sea ice. Hopefully that won't happen. It's about 3.5 metres thick, we think, from some of the satellite information. But to sort of try and cover the ground as efficiently and safe as possible, we have these objects down here. These are called Argos. They're basically all-terrain vehicles. They're developed in Canada. They work down to minus 40 degrees centigrade. They're basically boats with wheels on them. We can put tracks on them. And the practical upshot is not only do you have shelter, and you can, if you break through the ice, you'll be fine. They have, with the tracks, they distribute your body weight so much less, or so much more than, say, poor Ninnis who fell down a crevasse. So those tracks mean that the weight of the vehicles with the people in them is a fifth of that if you were just walking on the surface. So it's a difference between falling down a crevasse or a crack or just basically gliding or flying over the surface. They go about 20-30 kilometres an hour. Amazing bit of technology. And if you're interested, you can see a movie of us trying them out in Queensland just a few weeks ago. There was a couple of minutes worth of film footage of us putting them into cracking through the dirt or driving through the water as well. So I think that's enough for me now, but if you want to follow us, check out the Hangouts, and you can see if we hopefully get across this sea ice and get into Mawson's hut.